And thank you all for coming out today on this wonderful New England spring day. I hope you all don't mind if I put my phone here. I just want to time myself to make sure that I finish in time to answer y'all's questions, because that's the fun part, is actually hearing from you guys. So again, yeah, thank you for coming out. It's been an honor to collaborate with the staff here at the Historical Society. I was really excited to get the invitation from Becca and Ingrid Peters, the associate director, and it's been really a pleasure to work with the staff here, the really talented staff, Bridget Newton and Caleb Leho and everyone else, along with the fantastic creatives at H2 Design, to put together, what I think is not only a visually stunning exhibition, which I had nothing to do with the design. I wrote the text and picked the objects, but other people who have better eyes than I do, did all of this cool stuff. That I think it's incredible, not only in its appeal to visitors, and I think drawing people in, and commemorating obviously the revolution's 250th anniversary, which we're all scrambling to do right now, but also I think uniquely among commemoration of the 250th highlights a couple of key themes that really resonate in our own moment, and I want to talk about that a little bit in this lecture. And just as by way of introduction, in crafting the exhibit, when we started brainstorming this, we kind of had two aims. And the first and kind of most obvious was to make the revolution relatable to those who don't see themselves in the stories we tell about the founding of the United States. And I think many people in this room, probably grew up in the United States, went to elementary school, middle school, high school, learned about the revolution as a series of events, right? You've got the Stamp Act, and then the Boston Tea Party, and then Lexington and Concord, and then Bunker Hill, and then the Declaration of Independence, and the Saratoga, Yorktown, ad nauseum. And there's it's not a wrong narrative, but it does leave a lot out. It geographically, obviously, it centers mostly in Philadelphia, mostly in New York, in Boston, and not in other places like Newport, Rhode Island, which I hope as you go through the exhibit you'll see was really a crucial staging ground for the revolution, and a place where a lot of these revolutionary transformations happened. But we also don't know a lot of people outside of kind of the types of people who are involved in these events, who in the words of a high school teacher of mine, were well-bred, well-read, and I can't remember the third well, but it was essentially wealthy. And even those of us who are kind of steeped in this, right, who are either hobbyists or like me, it's a profession. We know a lot about people like Samuel Ward and William Ellery and Ezra Stiles and these kind of elite patriots. We don't know a lot about ordinary people, and Newport's kind of a perfect place to look into that, because after all, it was one of the most diverse, and at the risk of using kind of a loaded word these days, I do think it was a really diverse place in the 18th century, communities in North America, and one of the busiest ports in the entire British Empire. It was the fourth largest city in the American colonies. You think about that, right? It was up there with Boston and New York and Philadelphia as a trading port, and also as a cultural center. It had residents who ranged from Aaron Lopez, who's featured in this exhibit, the wealthiest resident of the town at the time of the Revolution, who was a Portuguese immigrant and a religious minority, a Jew, in a town dominated by various types of Protestant Christians. But ranging kind of from Lopez to Caesar Babcock, another young man that we profile in this exhibit, who was a young black man kidnapped from West Africa, brought to Newport against against his will, who labored alongside nearly 1,000 other people of African and native descent in the city. And again, we don't think of Newport, we think of Newport, as a place where merchants engaged in the slave trade, but we don't think of it as an actual site of enslavement. But almost 1 in 10 Newporters and more at certain times were enslaved during the Revolutionary era. So, and it's got everything in between. So it's the goal of the exhibit was to kind of get beyond the kind of founding fathers and the declaration signers and the revolutionary heroes. Don't worry, we've got a couple of those that we're going to talk a lot about next year. So if you can wait on that. But to really kind of make that relatable to create a story of the revolution that's relatable to people who maybe don't necessarily relate to those types of figures, right? Who can't really see themselves in someone like an Ellery or a Ward or a Washington or a Jefferson. So that was kind of the first goal, the first prong. And the second, in a larger sense, and this is part of my own research, as Becca mentioned, my focus is on popular politics, which is kind of a fancy way of saying, what uneducated people were doing in political activism that was largely kind of ignored by those up top, but actually had a major impact. And to kind of shift the conversation away from the kind of familiar stories of the revolution and of the nature and impact of the event, towards one that is not only more accurate, but I think more useful or at least more relevant to our current moment. And so a lot of us who grew up in the United States, grew up with what some of my colleagues call the bedtime story version of the American Revolution, right? And this is that scrappy band of colonists who defied a British Empire, founded a nation based on principles of individual liberty, equality under the law, access to opportunity, right? Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, touchstone, incidents, and we kind of, emphasize the ideas and the enlightened principles of it. But we have little understanding to this day, and this is after 250 odd years of people writing and studying the revolution, about not only how the revolution played out in the day-to-day lives of ordinary colonists, but also how those colonists and the decisions they made shaped the course of the revolution itself, and did so in really profound ways that I think help explain some of the questions that historians still struggle with about the revolution as a whole. So exploring the revolutionary experience at the individual level, and I think that's why the profiles in the exhibit are so important, as well as kind of drawing on the experiences of such a wide variety of people of different backgrounds, helps us open new angles. It helps us sidestep some of these kind of old tired debates about was the revolution a Lockean goal with everyone who wanted to have this libertarian dream of just owning their own property and leaving everyone alone and having their stockpile of guns, or was it this kind of based on civic virtue and this kind of debate if this liberal versus Republican debate and small l, small r, and not still important, but allows us to kind of shift and have a different perspective. It also allows us to see the revolution not as a singular event or even a series of events, but as a process where people made decisions day by day that weren't always necessarily based on ideas or principles or even that deeply thought out, that were based more on the individual circumstances of their lives and could really surprise historians as they go back. And doing this helps us answer a lot of questions that have stymied people for a long time. For example, why did some colonists immediately flock to the Patriot side while about an equal number remain loyal to the crown? How did media, how did ethnic and gender prejudices, how did religious principles play into the decisions that people made? How did people just live their lives in a period of unprecedented political upheaval? I think this is something that most of us can relate to at this moment, right? And how did the decisions they made in the course of that upheaval, and decisions not made, in an instant, no one, woke up one day and said, I am a patriot, or, well, I think I'll be a loyalist today, right? These are kind of, it's the same way you kind of, most of us come to our kind of political or social ideas, and how did these decisions shape the course of larger events? And finally, kind of what lessons can we draw on these experiences for our own times? So the exhibit asks the visitor to do a little more work than your typical museum exhibit. Instead of being a passive observer and seeing cherished relics and inspiring stories, and we do have inspiring stories and cherished relics. There's a Paul Revere piece over there. There's a cannon that was dug up from the bottom of Narragansett Bay. There's plenty of cool stuff here. But it also asks visitors to put themselves in the shoes of participants in Newport's revolution. And here's the tricky part. It asks you to emphasize, even with those who have gone down in history as enemies of the American project, or who had different ideas about what the revolution should be fighting for. So what follows here in the next 20-25 minutes is a brief overview of three of the exhibit's main themes, with an emphasis on the experiences of 18th century Newporters, and some highlighting of some of these reverberations. And I'm going to draw on kind of three that I think are most relevant for our moment today, and at the risk of kind of being too anachronistic, which you all can take me to task for in the Q&A if you so wish. My students are really good at doing that, so I'm used to it, trust me. And I'll start with the first one, and the reason we opened the exhibit with the printing press and with the kind of flood of newsprint that you see as you come in is to stress not only the importance of print media to the coming of the revolution, and this is something that historians have been talking about for quite a while. We have a lot of good studies from the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s on revolutionary pamphlets and the type of arguments people are making in these in newspapers and pamphlets and books in the lead up to the revolution during the imperial crisis. But to kind of give visitors a sense of how that information got to people. Because it's one thing to say, here are these ideas kind of floating around in documents, but it's another to say, okay, how are people reading these documents? How are people interpreting these things? The first of this is that the press in revolutionary America was explicitly political. People knew that newspapers had a slant, that newspapers were going to print things based on the beliefs of their proprietors. When the Newport Mercury came into the hands of Solomon Southwick, who was an inveterate member of first the colonial resistance and then Newport's and Rhode Island's revolutionary government after 1775, people knew that he was presenting a patriot perspective. And that tinged the way they read his paper. He also printed loyalist material. The one on the right here is a very infamous pamphlet, a letter from a gentleman in Halifax to his friend in Newport. He actually lived in Newport, not Halifax, but was trying to kind of, I think, dodge repercussions. Didn't work. They stripped his house and kicked him out of town. But largely, the debate, the terms of the debate were set by access to these materials, at least kind of in the decade preceding the Revolution. And colonial Americans got their news from a variety of places, just like we do today. The most common were newspapers like the Newport Mercury, which were the most affordable, printed bi-weekly, a very few weekly, some of them more frequently. Pretty low subscription circulations, and again, we think today of, relaxing with your Sunday paper, I don't know, no one does that anymore, right? I do that sometimes, but, it's Sunday paper on the iPad these days. But, we think of, relaxing with your Sunday paper, and a cup of coffee, but reading the newspaper in colonial America was a social event. Newspapers were laid out in taverns, in coffee houses, in mantua shops, in craft workshops, for patrons to browse as they waited, and for people to kind of discuss at bars and restaurants as they socialized. Which means that people aren't reading every single word of the newspaper. People are, picking and choosing. People are finding different articles, and newspapermen are cognizant of this. Southwick is printing things in the newspaper that are kind of short pieces. This one on the right here is another letter that's printed in the Newport Mercury that has kind of a revolutionary argument, but they're meant to be shared. And a lot of times, and literacy rates are a hotly debated topic among historians. I'm not going to dive into that because if this gets on the video and some other historian sees me, he's going to say, Johnson said that 70% of people were literate and it's actually 65. But enough colonists were literate or semi-literate enough to get this stuff. But those that weren't often heard it out loud because at taverns and at coffee shops, people would sit there and read interesting articles and snippets of articles. And then as they read, people would interrupt them and say, well, hey, I don't agree with that. That's BS. Or, hey, what about what this guy says in this newspaper that's over on this table? And so the news, we think of it as this, set in stone thing, and maybe not so much over the last decade, but, it's fungible in colonial America. And there's a lot of confusion about it. But it also has an incredible potential to drive political conversation and to mobilize people. And a lot of recent work has shown, and some of the documents that are out in that first room demonstrate that these are really powerful arguments, and these are really kind of inspiring arguments. Common Sense, which is published in January of 1776, which Southwick published the first Rhode Island edition on that press, sells 100,000 copies in its first 6 months. And that's a population of about 2 million, right? And if you think a population of about 2 million, most of whom are engaged in subsistence agriculture, and this costs about 2 weeks' wages for a farm laborer, that's a lot of circulation. And then again, you think of kind of the impact it has being read and being shared. And even in other elements, there's subtle message here. One of the things that Southwick prints actually makes most of his money on is printing almanacs. People bought almanacs every year because they kind of forecasted the weather. They told you when all the holidays were. They actually, what people really wanted them for is they told you the latest exchange rates between Spanish gold and British pounds and Dutch florins and all of the various currencies that were floating around in the Atlantic world. But these also had kind of political messages. The first almanacs printed after the Declaration of Independence were not printed they were printed with the year 1776 Anno Domini, but also the year 1 of American independence, which was a break from printing kind of the year whatever in the reign of King George III. They had these kind of subtle messages. So I think, this is the role of print and the physicality of print is something that we really wanted to bring to the fore. It's something that kind of humanizes this experience, and it shows you that, we often think of, in looking at the past, we kind of assume that our ancestors or the people who lived here 250 years ago, somehow had perfect information, right? Somehow we're able to be like, I agree with the Patriots, and so I'm going to go join the Patriot side. Or I agree with the Loyalists, I'm going to go join the Loyalist side, where a lot of them are just trying to figure out what's going on. And they're reading things printed by different people or written by different people and kind of reading them with a grain of salt or reading them against, their own beliefs in order to figure out just what to do. And it gives you a sense of kind of how people are actually engaging with the oncoming revolution. And once the revolution breaks out, the press gets even more political and even more partisan. So that's the first theme here. And I think the second one, and the section we're sitting in now, and the other section in the other room, is a sense of escalating violence. And again, this is something we don't tend to get from traditional narratives of the revolution, right? We think of the revolution as again, a series of set events, some of which are violent, some of which, are maybe not so violent, right? We have the Stamp Act protests. Well, people got tarred and feathered, some houses got burned. Tarring and feathering is really bad, by the way. It's not just like a joke. Anyone who's seen like the John Adams miniseries can testify to that. It's a pretty violent act. But, and then, after the outbreak of war, obviously there's these pitched battles, right? In Rhode Island, there's the burning of the Gaspee. There's the bombardment of places like Jamestown. And this is, sorry, I was trying to use the pointer, but oops. No, it doesn't work. The one on the right is a kind of a map of the bombardment of Prudence Island, which was one of these part of the bombardments that occurred in the late summer and fall of 1775. What we don't get, though, is that violence isn't a one-time thing. Right? It has effects that linger beyond specific events. Experiencing a riot could leave lasting trauma. Martin Howard, right, who authored this pamphlet, Letters from a Gentleman from Halifax, was a loyalist pamphlet that essentially got him run out of town, had a lot of trauma out of that, right? He wasn't physically harmed, but his house was ransacked, his property was destroyed, he was forced to flee for his life, and then 10 years later he was forced to flee from his life again when revolutionaries took over North Carolina, where he had moved after Newport. And this happened on the Patriot side too. Attacks by British regulars. Right? We think of kind of like redcoats as these kind of silly figures, right? Who wear these giant red coats with white sashes and march around all kind of official-like. Well, this was the most fearsome, most experienced, most well-funded and well-organized army in the world at the time. And it was fresh off of victory in one of the greatest and largest wars to that date in the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. And so the threat of British regulars or the British Navy attacking your town or attacking, or going up into battle with them was terrifying and left a lot of people traumatized. And not only soldiers like these members of the 1st Rhode Island here, and this is a black member of the 1st Rhode Island. It's a little later than the period we're talking about. It's from a French officer's depiction after the Battle of Yorktown. But it's this visceral reaction. And not only kind of experiences of violence do this, there's threats of violence which can be even more pernicious. I mean, could you imagine living under the threat of constant blockade and constant bombardment, where at any moment a ship carrying tons, I don't know, Dr. Hattendorf can probably tell me how many tons of cannonballs that the HMS Rose carried on any given day, but you know, that could level a city, right? I mean, and this happened. Falmouth was leveled in 1775. Norfolk is burned to the ground by the British Navy in a bombardment in early 1776. Jamestown, just over there, is totally destroyed by the British Navy. I mean, this is heavy stuff. And you can imagine people kind of living their everyday lives under that kind of pressure and the decisions that they make. And we talked about a few of them in this exhibit, right, with John G. Wanton, with Aaron Lopez, and I won't get into this too much because I actually want you guys to go and read the text. But that's one of the themes that we wanted to bring out is that violence is a major component of the American Revolution that we don't often engage with. Right? And not to mention, and this is something we'll engage a little bit more in next year's exhibit, Newport was, for a lot of the revolution, in part a giant POW camp. First for Continental and Rhode Island militia soldiers who resided on prison ships and in a decrepit fort, and then for British POWs when the French are here. Sorry, what's that?
Jamestown.
Yeah. So it's there's a lot of this kind of tension going on, and again, it leaves a mark, and it affects a lot of people's decisions. The third one here is a rapid and vicious polarization. And this is something that happens, that surprises even the most vehement patriots. The people who were already kind of in the tank for the revolution as early as, the mid-1760s, they're shocked at how fast people start flocking to either the revolutionary cause or to the King's banner after April of 1775. One historian calls this a rage militaire on the Patriot side, where tens of thousands of young men throughout the colonies volunteer to fight the British. A lot of them just kind of shoulder their muskets and start marching towards Boston without really any organization. And part of my new project is looking at the people who came and actually tried to organize them on the local level and maintain some kind of a discipline. But there's also this kind of dividing of this community. People start making lists. It's never a good sign when people start making lists. The one you see on the right here is in the Rhode Island State Archives. I think we have it over here too. It's a list of people who were suspected of holding loyalist beliefs. And well, what does that mean? In some cases, it means you were down at the White Horse Tavern and you raised your glass and said, "Long life to King George." Well, I mean, in 1773, that's a perfectly patriotic toast. In January of 1775, that's a perfectly patriotic toast. In May of 1775, after Lexington and Concord, or in July of 1775, after Bunker Hill, that could get you on a list. Quakers are on this list. A lot of Quakers, because they refused to sign oaths of allegiance to the new revolutionary government. Now, Quakers don't sign any oaths, so why does that make them suspicious? Part of this is that the revolutionaries are trying to do what revolutionaries do. They're trying to figure out who their allies are, who their enemies are, and who the people who are in between that they need to kind of intimidate or sweet talk into joining them. It's a lot of give and take. But it has serious consequences. It divides families and communities permanently. All of Newport's religious congregations, bar none, except maybe the Anglicans, but even some of them are split, are shattered by the Revolution. All of Newport's social societies, I mean, the Redwood Library has an equal number of loyalists and patriots on its rolls in 1775. I mean, it's a thing reading these things, right? Like, I mean, John G. Wanton, his cousin, Joseph Wanton Jr., is the leading loyalist in town and the head of a loyalist militia. And in fact, when the British come and occupy the island, he becomes the superintendent of the civilian arm of the British regime. And yet John G. and his family become patriots. And his daughter even marries one of George Washington's aides. So this totally shatters the community. It also creates this, and this is a later image, of a loyalist refugee camp in Canada, because it creates this area where people have to leave because of their political decisions. Charles Dudley, who's another one of our profiled people, the Newport's tax collector from, I think 1764, it might be 1765, don't quote me on that, he's an immigrant, but he marries into a prominent Newport family. He's friendly with prominent Newport merchants like John G. Wanton and Aaron Lopez. There's some evidence that he, kind of looks the other way when they have cargoes that aren't entirely legal, and sometimes they give him a little gratuity in return, and it's all, this is the way 18th century kind of, British bureaucracy worked. In November of 1775, the Rhode Island government comes to his house and says essentially, that customs chest that you have that is property of the king, well, we would like it to fund the revolution. And he says, well, I signed this oath to the king when I got my appointment, and, I love my Rhode Island wife and my Rhode Island in-laws, but, I don't really feel comfortable handing over this money. And so he has to flee on board a warship in Newport Harbor, and he never gets to come home again. He lives the rest of his life kind of in obscurity in London. And the revolution creates tens of thousands of these types of refugees. People, who end up in Nova Scotia, who end up in the Caribbean, who end up in West Africa or Britain. What historians even trace some of these people as far as Australia, in these kind of far corners of the British Empire. So it's this really, divisive thing. And it happens really, really quickly. Again, it's this thing where in January, or even in May of 1775, you see these people socializing. You see these people meeting in the same spaces. You see these people joining each other for tea and marrying each other's children. And then suddenly there's this division. Again, this is something many of us can relate to today. So I'll conclude here by, first of all, I'll show the cutest visitor to this exhibit. This is my son Francis, who came here last Friday, and fittingly enough wanted to be both a patriot and a loyalist. So I think he gets the theme of the exhibit. But a couple of lessons to kind of take away for our times, and at the risk of being a little too heavy-handed here, and again, you can take me to task for that if you wish. Come on. First is media can both drive political unrest and promote unity. So one of the things media does, the colonial media and Southwick's press does really well is drive that wedge between patriots and loyalists. As soon as the war breaks out, he's got all of these stories about how, loyalists are plotting to destroy everything, and loyalists are, the root of everything, and there's tons more loyalists than we know about, and we just have to be on guard, and there's all of this kind of anti-British sentiment. But it also serves to promote unity among the patriot side and to unify what had been kind of a diverse coalition of wealthy merchants and poor apprentices and middling craftspeople and yeoman farmers who all have different interests and different ideas of what the revolution should be. I'm happy to get into that in the Q&A, into a revolutionary political organization, or at least to buy into this revolutionary project that they can go and get behind and join the army or support in some way. Second is that violence and the threat of violence often matters in revolutions or in times of political upheaval as much or more than ideology and rhetoric. And I think this is something that a lot of our media today really misses, is that a lot of what's driving politics, so what drives politics, is violence. It's the threat of political violence. And when politics gets violent, people start to get scared. People have to make decisions not only based on their beliefs, but based on protecting their families, based on protecting their lives, based on protecting their property. I mean, it's one thing if, and there's plenty of loyalists who sympathized with the revolutionary project. There were plenty of loyalists who wanted better representation. There were plenty of loyalists who wanted fairer taxes and a new constitutional settlement. But when the war started, when patriots started tarring and feathering people or imprisoning people or putting people in the stocks or even in a few rare cases executing people, well, that kind of got them scared. They decided maybe it's time to get out of Dodge. Or on the other side, people may have been totally loyal to the king, right? I mean, Lopez, we have no evidence that he was anything but a loyal British subject. And in fact, he had probably the most to lose of wealthy Newporters, or at least in the Jewish community, because he was actually a naturalized British citizen, which was a really unusual thing for a Jewish person because Jewish people generally weren't allowed to naturalize, but Massachusetts allowed him to naturalize in the colony, and that brought with it citizenship in the British Empire. So he had the rights of British citizenship. But he sides with the Patriots. And you have to think, maybe the gangs of people going around with clubs, probably some of whom were his apprentices and his mariners, had a lot to do with that. Thirdly, that polarization happens quicker than you expect and takes decades to heal. And we see this in the American Revolution. We do see reconciliation between patriots and loyalists. It doesn't happen until the mid-1780s and really until the 1790s and after the War of 1812. And a lot of kind of the War of 1812 is this kind of reprise of the conflict between patriots and loyalists, because the settlers of Anglo-Canada are by and large loyalist refugees who moved to Ontario and Anglophone parts of Quebec, and then end up fighting again against the United States. And by the 1800s, 18-teens, and somewhat earlier, in some places it happens earlier, Alexander Hamilton is a huge proponent of bringing the Loyalists back, not surprisingly for financial reasons, because he says, it's the Loyalists who have a lot of the money, and we need that money to fund our financial system. But it takes a long time once these splits happen, and these splits happen, pretty rapidly, to heal them and to get back to kind of a reconciliation. So this has all been really depressing, but I want to end on a hopeful note, which is also it shows us that we've been through really divisive times, really politically tumultuous times, really violent times in the past, and we've come out the other side. And I think a lot of the success of the early republic, the success of the United States in the 1790s, the 1800s, and through the Jacksonian era, is due to kind of learning some of these lessons of the revolution. I think a lot of these revolutionaries remembered how divisive the early years of the war and the revolution were. I think they didn't want that to happen again. And I think they exercised a lot more care and a lot more wisdom in their future endeavors. I think the fact that America had peaceful politics from 1783 until 1861 is a testament to that. And this goes against the expectations of every observer outside of the continental US. Every political theorist in the 18th century and even into the 19th century said this won't last. That these Americans are too divided. Virginians don't like Massachusettsans. South Carolinians don't like North Carolinians. Vermonters and New Hampshireites are at each other's throats. No one likes Rhode Islanders, no offense. It's going to crumble. And all of these colonies and new states are going to go to war with each other, within a decade or two. But that doesn't happen. There's disputes. There's a few rebellions within the states. There's the Whiskey Rebellion. There's Shays' Rebellion. There's a couple of rebellions, minor rebellions in the 19th century. But by and large, these don't involve a lot of violence. And they involve kind of negotiated settlements and a lot of grace. I think one of the reasons, Washington in 1794 pardons the whiskey rebels. He captures the leaders, they're sentenced to death for treason, and he pardons them. I think that has a lot to do with the experience of the revolution, with the idea that if you let things get too divided, if you let things get too bad, that takes forever to come back from. That is not a recipe for harmonious society. And I hope it's a lesson that we can learn in our own times. So with that, I'll end here, and I'll be happy to take your questions.